welcome back." They laughed, not because they understood you. No, that would have required depth. They laughed because it was easier to label you, dismiss you, shrink you into something they could feel bigger than. You stayed quiet, not weak, just calculating every joke they made, every doubt they threw at you. You collected it, studied it, like pieces of a puzzle they didn't even know they were building for you. Right? See, while they were busy performing for the crowd, you were watching the patterns, learning the rules, then breaking them silently. Now the room feels different. Same faces, same voices, but something's off. Because the one they underestimated rewrote the game without asking for permission. And suddenly, they're not laughing anymore. They saw you quiet and decided they had you figured out. No noise, no resistance, no need to take you seriously. In their world, volume equals power, and silence must mean you have none. So they filled the space you left open with their own assumptions, their own laughter, their own shallow conclusions. Bond. You didn't correct them. You let them believe it. Man, because people reveal more when they think you're not a threat. They get comfortable, careless, honest in the worst way. They speak without filters, act without caution, expose every weakness they try so hard to hide behind confidence. And you watched, not with anger, not even with frustration, just patience, the kind that unsettles people when they finally notice it, the kind that doesn't need validation or applause to keep going. They mistook that patience for fear. They thought your restraint was hesitation, that your silence was emptiness, that if you had something worth saying, you would have said it by now. But what they never understood is that speaking too soon is what gives power away. Noise is predictable. Reactions are easy to control, but silence forces people to reveal themselves. So you stayed quiet while they talked. You let them build their image of you, small, harmless, irrelevant. Every joke they made at your expense only made that image clearer in their minds. They needed you to be less so they could feel like more, and you let them have that illusion. Because illusions are useful. While they were busy laughing, you were noticing patterns. Who leads? Who follows? Who pretends? Who breaks under pressure? Who hides insecurity behind arrogance? They thought they were just passing time, but every word they spoke was getting you information, and information changes everything. That you didn't rush to prove anything. No sudden moves, no desperate attempts to be understood. That's what they expected. That's what would have made you predictable. Instead, you stayed exactly where they placed you until they stopped paying attention. That's when control starts to shift, bend, because the moment someone decides you're not a threat, they stop guarding themselves around you. They stop questioning your presence. They stop preparing for your moves. And without realizing it, they hand you access. Men's access to their habits, their reactions, their blind spots. They thought you were standing still, but you were positioning. Every second of silence was intentional. Every moment they ignored you was an opportunity. Not to fight back, not to argue, not to demand respect, but to understand the structure they were operating in. And once you understand the structure, you don't need to force anything. You just wait for the right point, and everything shifts on its own. They were loud, always loud. Every room they entered turned into a stage, every conversation into a performance. They needed eyes on them, needed reactions, needed that constant confirmation that they mattered. Words spilling out fast, confident, rehearsed without them even realizing it. And while they performed, you watched, not passively, not absent, completely present in a way they could never understand. Because when someone is busy being seen, they stop seeing. When someone is focused on impressing, they stop observing. They trade awareness for attention, and they don't even notice the cost. But you did, Mond. You noticed the rhythm in their voices, the way certain names made them shift tone, the way confidence cracked just slightly when they weren't in control of the conversation, the way laughter changed depending on who was listening. Real laughter, forced laughter, defensive laughter, all different, all revealing something they thought was hidden. They thought they were leading. Molian. But leaders don't need constant validation. Performers do, and performers follow a script, even when they think they're improvising. Patterns start to repeat. The same jokes land in the same way. The same reactions triggered by the same situations. Becomes not obvious at first. But if you stay quiet long enough, if you watch without interrupting, the patterns start to stack up. And patterns are everything, because once you see them, you don't have to guess anymore. You don't have to react. You already know what comes next. You already know who will speak, who will agree, who will laugh, who will pretend to disagree just to keep the act interesting. Banda, they called it confidence. You saw it as routine. They thought they were spontaneous, unpredictable, impossible to read. But people who need attention are the easiest to understand. They'll always choose the reaction that keeps them in the spotlight. They'll always say the thing that gets the most response. It's not freedom. It's dependency, and dependency creates blind spots. While they were busy projecting an image, you were studying the cracks in it. The small inconsistencies, the hesitation before certain answers, the way some topics were avoided completely, the way dominance shifted when certain people entered the room. No one else noticed. And because everyone else was too busy reacting. That's the difference. Reactions are immediate. Observation takes time. And time is something they couldn't afford to give. Because the moment they stopped performing, the silence would expose them. But silence never exposed you. It protected you. Monet gave you space to think, to connect details, to see beyond what was being shown. You weren't distracted by appearances because you never needed to be part of them. You weren't chasing attention so you could focus on understanding. And understanding is power. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needs to announce itself, the kind that sits quietly, unnoticed, until the moment it decides to act. They thought you weren't doing anything, and that you were just there, existing in the background, disconnected from the energy of the room. But the background is where everything becomes clear. No pressure to impress, no need to speak, no expectations to meet. Just observation, and the more they performed, the more they revealed. Every exaggerated reaction, every forced laugh, every attempt to dominate the moment. It all added up, a complete picture forming slowly, piece by piece, while they stayed convinced that nothing about them was being understood. Planned. They were so focused on being seen, they never realized they were being studied. Every word they threw at you, they thought it disappeared the moment it left their mouth. Just noise, just jokes, just passing moments that meant nothing beyond a quick reaction. But you didn't treat it like noise, Bandon. You treated it like evidence. Every insult had a pattern. Every joke had a direction. People don't speak randomly. They reveal themselves, especially when they think they're in control. The things they chose to mock, the timing of their words, the confidence behind them. It all pointed to something deeper than they intended to show. And you listened, not emotionally. You stripped the words down to what they actually were. Signals, indicators of how they think, what they fear, where they feel strong, and where they're fragile. Pelend, they called you slow for not reacting. You called it processing. And because reacting would have given them exactly what they wanted. Confirmation that their words had power over you. That they could control the moment, control your emotions, control the narrative. But when you don't react, something strange happens. They start talking more, filling the silence, repeating themselves, trying harder to get a response, and the harder they try, the more they reveal. The jokes become sharper, then sloppier. The confidence becomes forced. The intent becomes clearer, and all of it becomes data. Bond. You didn't need to argue. You didn't need to defend yourself. Every insult they threw was already giving you more than you could have taken from any conversation. It showed you what they value, what they disrespect, what they misunderstand. It showed you their limits. Because people attack what they don't understand or what they secretly feel threatened by. They expose their insecurities without realizing it, dressing them up as humor or criticism. And you let them pander. You let them believe they were winning, that every word they spoke was pushing you down, putting you in your place. Because the more comfortable they felt in that illusion, the less guarded they became. That's when the real information comes out, not the surface-level jokes, but the underlying patterns. Who repeats the same type of insult? Who follows others instead of thinking for themselves? Who hesitates before speaking, then forces confidence to hide it? Who enjoys the attention of putting someone else down? Remember, all of it stored not as emotion, not as resentment, but as understanding. But you didn't carry the weight of their words. You carried the meaning behind them. That's the difference. Because words lose power when you stop taking them personally. But they gain value when you start analyzing them. When you see them as tools instead of attacks. Every insult became a map. Showing you exactly where they were strong and exactly where they were exposed, showing you how they think under pressure, how they react when they feel dominant, how they behave when they believe no one is challenging them. And maps lead somewhere. They thought they were just talking, but they were building something for you, piece by piece, without realizing it, giving you insight they would never offer intentionally, handing you clarity they didn't even know they possessed. You didn't interrupt. You didn't correct them. You just kept collecting, because the more they spoke, the clearer everything became. Rules. They cling to them like lifelines. Invisible lines drawn by people who were just as uncertain, just as afraid, but louder about it. Follow this, don't do that. Speak here, stay quiet there. Act this way if you want to be accepted. Break that, and suddenly you're the problem. They live inside those lines, not because they have to, but because it's easier, predictable, safe. When everyone agrees on the same rules, no one has to think too hard. No one has to question why things are the way they are. They just play along, convinced that the structure itself is power. And you saw it, not immediately. At first, it just looked like order, like the way things are supposed to be. But the longer you stayed quiet, the more the pattern revealed itself. The same reactions triggered by the same behaviors. Approval given on schedule. Rejection delivered like a script. It wasn't freedom, it was repetition. Blamed they weren't choosing their moves. They were following them. conditioned responses dressed up as personality. They thought they were being themselves, but they were just staying within the boundaries that kept them comfortable, and comfort creates predictability. Once you notice that, everything changed, because rules only have power when you believe in them, when you accept them without question, when you assume they're fixed, unbreakable, necessary. But when you step back, really step back, you start to see the cracks. You start to see where the rules contradict themselves, where they only apply to certain people, in certain situations, where they shift depending on who's watching, where they're enforced not for fairness, but for control. That's when they stop being rules, and start being tools. They use them to maintain their position, their image, their sense of control, to keep everything running in a way that benefits them, even if they don't consciously realize it. It's not always intentional. Most of them are just repeating what they've seen, what they've been taught, what's always worked before. But repetition isn't truth. And once you see that, you stop playing the same way. Ambient, you didn't break the rules immediately. That would have been obvious, predictable in its own way. They expect rebellion to look loud, chaotic, emotional. Something they can point at and say, see? That's why the rules exist. So you stayed within them, at least on the surface. Maybe you followed just enough to avoid attention, just enough to blend in, just enough to keep them comfortable. Because the moment people feel challenged directly, they close off. They defend the structure without even questioning it. But underneath, you were adjusting small shifts at first, testing boundaries without announcing it, seeing which rules actually mattered and which ones only existed because no one dared to question them. You pushed where it was safe, pulled back where it wasn't, mapping out the edges of the system they thought was solid, and the more you tested it, the more it bent, not all at once, not dramatically, quietly, subtly, enough to confirm what you already suspected. Most of what they believed in wasn't as fixed as they thought. And that's when control starts to slip, land you. Because once you know the rules are flexible, you stop treating them as limits. You start treating them as options, something you can follow, ignore, or reshape, depending on what serves you best in the moment. And they were still playing by the old structure, still expecting the same cause and effect. If this happens, then that follows. If someone does this, they respond like that. It's all predictable when everyone agrees to the same system. But you didn't, not anymore. You moved differently. Pain, sometimes following the rules perfectly, blending in so well they forgot you were even there. Other times bending them just enough to create confusion. Not enough to be called out, but enough to disrupt. And confusion is powerful because when people don't understand what's happening, they hesitate, and hesitation breaks rhythm. It creates gaps, moments where the script no longer fits the situation. They start second-guessing, not you, themselves. Why didn't that work the way it usually does? Why didn't you react the way they expected? Why does something feel slightly off, even though everything looks the same? That's the shift. You didn't destroy the rules. You made them unreliable. And once the system becomes unreliable, the people depending on it start to lose their footing. They can't predict outcomes the same way. They can't control reactions the same way. Their confidence starts to crack, not because they're being attacked, but because their foundation isn't as stable as they believed. Bleens. All without you ever raising your voice. all without you ever announcing what you were doing. Just small changes, quiet decisions that slowly reshape the environment around you while they're still trying to play by rules that no longer work the way they used to. It didn't happen with a bang. No dramatic moment. No sudden realization spreading across their faces like in the stories they like to tell. Control doesn't shift like that. It moves quietly, almost politely, while everyone is busy looking somewhere else. They were still talking the same way, same tone, same confidence, same rhythm they always relied on. From the outside, nothing had changed. The room looked identical. The energy felt familiar. But underneath, something was off. And they could feel it, not clearly, not enough to point at. Just a slight disruption in the flow they were used to controlling, like a step taken too early in a dance, or a response that came a second too late. Small things, easy to ignore at first, but they add up, Pond. Because when people are used to being in control, they rely on predictability. They expect certain reactions from certain people. They expect their words to land in specific ways. They expect the environment to behave according to patterns they've memorized over time. And you stopped feeding those patterns. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention. You didn't suddenly become loud or confrontational. That would have been easy to handle, easy to label, easy to push back against. You stayed composed, vain, but your responses changed. Sometimes you didn't respond at all. Other times you responded just enough to disrupt the rhythm, a pause where they expected immediacy. A neutral expression where they expected discomfort, a simple acknowledgement where they expected resistance, nothing extreme, just different. And different is dangerous when people rely on consistency. At first, they brushed it off. Everyone has off days, right? Maybe you were distracted. Maybe you didn't hear them properly. Maybe the timing was just off. And so they tried again. Same approach, same tone, same expectation. But the result didn't match. That's when doubt starts to creep in. Not about you, about their own method. Because when something that always worked suddenly doesn't, the first instinct isn't to question the target. It's to question the process. Why didn't that land the same way? Why didn't you react like before? Leaned. Why does it feel like something's slipping, even though nothing obvious has changed? They couldn't see the shift. But they could feel it, and feeling without understanding creates tension. Their confidence started to lean a little harder, as if pushing more force into the same actions would restore the balance. Louder jokes, sharper comments, more effort poured into maintaining the image they were comfortable with. But effort without awareness only makes the cracks more visible. Bland, because the harder they tried, the more inconsistent their results became. What used to guarantee a reaction now fell flat. What used to control the mood now created hesitation. The room didn't respond the way it used to. Not because the environment changed. Because you removed yourself from their equation. They were still applying the same inputs, expecting the same outputs. But the system they relied on had been quietly altered. One variable changed everything, and they didn't even realize which one it was. That's the unsettling part. Not knowing where the control went, they couldn't call you out because you weren't doing anything obvious. You weren't breaking rules, not openly. You weren't confronting them, not directly. From the surface, You were still the same quiet presence they had already categorized, but the results said otherwise. Okay? And results are harder to ignore than appearances. The room began to shift in subtle ways. Conversations didn't flow as smoothly. Reactions came with a slight delay. People started looking around, trying to read the atmosphere before responding. Instead of acting automatically, that hesitation spread. Blame because once one person feels it, others pick up on it. Not consciously, but instinctively. The rhythm breaks, and without rhythm, control becomes fragile. They started adjusting small changes, at first tweaking their approach, trying different angles, watching more closely than they used to, something they never felt the need to do before. Schliend. Now they were observing, the same way you had been, but they were late. Punglens. Because observation only works when it starts before the shift, not after it. By the time they began paying attention, the structure they depended on had already moved out from under them. And now they were reacting, trying to catch up to something they couldn't fully see. Palander, the balance they once held so easily, no longer responded to them the same way. No? And the more they tried to regain it, the more obvious it became that it wasn't theirs anymore. They still think they're playing the same game. Same rules, same moves, same outcomes, waiting at the end like they always did. They step forward with that familiar confidence, expecting the ground beneath them to respond the way it used to. Muscle memory, habit. The illusion of control stitched together from repetition, but something doesn't align. They make a move, and it doesn't land. Not wrong, just ineffective. Like speaking into a room that no longer echoes back. Like pressing a button that used to trigger a reaction, now met with silence or something slightly off. Not enough to alarm them immediately, but enough to unsettle. So they try again, adjusting tone, adjusting timing, repeating patterns that have always worked for them. Because when something fails once, the instinct isn't to abandon it, it's to reinforce it. Apply. More pressure. Add more confidence. Push harder. But the response stays unpredictable, and unpredictability. That's where discomfort begins. They start scanning for answers, looking around, not for you specifically, but for confirmation that the system is still intact, that the structure they've relied on hasn't shifted without their permission. Everything looks the same. Same people, same space, same conversations unfolding in familiar shapes. But the outcomes don't match. That's when the tension grows. Balia. Because now they're forced into something they're not used to. Thinking, not reacting, not performing, not following the script they've memorized. Actually thinking about what's happening, why it's happening, and where it's leading. And thinking slows people down. They hesitate before speaking, just for a second, but it's there. A pause where confidence used to be automatic. A gap where certainty once lived. They're no longer moving freely. They're calculating. Trying to predict what comes next. Trying to understand what changed. Trying to regain a sense of control that used to come naturally. But every calculation is based on an outdated map. Every prediction built on patterns that no longer behave the same way, so the results stay inconsistent. One moment things seem normal, the next they don't. One move works slightly, the next falls apart completely. No clear pattern, no reliable outcome, And that's the trap. Not something you closed around them all at once. Not something they saw forming and failed to escape. Something they walked into slowly, comfortably, step by step, thinking they were still in control the entire time. Dongdia. Because the trap isn't physical, it's structural. It's built from expectations that no longer hold, from habits that no longer lead where they used to, from confidence that's no longer supported by results. Pleans. They're stuck inside a system that responds differently now, but they're still using the same inputs. And the more they rely on those inputs, the deeper they go. They try to dominate conversations, but the reactions don't feed them the same way. They try to provoke, but the response doesn't escalate like it used to. They try to control the mood, but something keeps slipping out of their grasp, so they push harder, because that's all they know. More effort, more intensity, more attempts to force the environment back into something familiar. But force without understanding only tightens the loop. It keeps them cycling through the same actions, expecting different results, growing more frustrated each time, and frustration clouds clarity. And now their decisions aren't precise anymore. They're reactive, slightly rushed, slightly desperate, even if they won't admit it. The confidence is still there on the surface, but underneath, it's unstable, because control without awareness doesn't last. Pauline. They start watching more closely, trying to figure out where it all shifted. And slowly, almost reluctantly, their attention starts to move toward you. Not because you've done anything obvious, but because nothing else explains the difference. You're still quiet, still composed, still exactly where they left you. But now that stillness feels different, not empty, not passive. Something else. Something they can't quite define, but can't ignore either. Because and you're the only constant that doesn't behave the way it used to in their mind. Blend. That's when realization begins to form. Not fully, not clearly, just enough to create unease. Blend. Because if the system has changed and you're the only variable they never truly understood, then maybe the control they thought they had was never as solid as they believed. Right? And now, every move they make has to pass through uncertainty first. Every decision filtered through doubt. Every action slowed by the need to reconsider what used to be automatic. They're still in motion. But it's no longer free. It's contained, right? Guided by something they don't fully see. Responding to something they don't fully understand. Moving through a structure that no longer belongs to them.